So let's open Tableau, and under accelerators, let's open the preloaded dataset called Superstore. When it opens, you will see many graphs already created. We want a blank workbook. So let's go down to the bottom here and open a new workbook. So on the left-hand side, where it says data, we want to be using sample Superstore. So let's click on that. We are, in this exercise, interested in performing some analytics on this workbook, which contains data about sales from different superstores for different states around the country, because we are interested in developing a marketing campaign. And we want to know how many campaigns we need to run to be effective. So we're going to drag sales under rows, and we don't want the sum of sales, we want the average. So click on the arrow, measure is going to be average. Then we want to use states in the columns. So back under orders, we can see location. Let's click on the little expansion. And let's drag state, province to columns. So now we have a graph and we want to sort it in descending order. Okay, looks good. So now if we go on the left-hand side, we have a tab called Analytics. Let's select that. And under Model, we have Cluster. So let's grab and drop over the graph. This will then open a dialog box for the cluster algorithm. And right now, it's clustering the data automatically. And we can tell that it worked because on the right, where it says clusters, we now have 2 clusters and 2 different colors. So the algorithm did this automatically, and the results will really depend on your version of Tableau, but also on the predefined settings. So it may look slightly different to what I have. Now, remember that clustering is unsupervised. So now we need to ask ourselves, do 2 clusters make sense? In our example, we are looking at sales across states, and the data was grouped into 2 clusters. So this would mean we would run 2 different marketing campaigns. Now, let's play around with that a little bit more. Let's change the number of clusters to 5. Now the algorithm recalculated and is now showing us 5 different groups. So it's showing Wyoming in a separate cluster from Vermont, and then 3 other clusters for the rest of the states. Does it make sense? Maybe, but we would need to investigate the data further to understand why. But in this case, we would now have 5 different marketing campaigns. So now let's dig deeper into the results. Under the Marks toolbox, under clusters, let's click on the arrow and let's click on Describe Clusters. This opens a dialog box, which shows us all different sorts of statistics. What we're interested in is at the bottom, so scroll down. And now what we see is that the analysis is giving us 5 different clusters and is telling us how many items are in each of the clusters, so how many states. So cluster 5 and 4 is probably Wyoming and Vermont, and then we have the other 3 clusters. It's also telling us what is the average sales for each of the cluster. So what we're really looking for is the average that represents a cluster statistically significant in the difference to the other clusters. And intuitively, between cluster 4 and 5, it seems to make sense. It's double. And maybe between cluster 4 and 3, it also makes sense. But then the other 3 clusters are quite similar, and it's possible that they are not statistically different. So this may be indicating that perhaps we have too many clusters. So let's try again. Let's close, and this time let's do 3 clusters. Now, the algorithm has recalculated and is separating Wyoming from Vermont from the rest of the state. Does this make sense? Possibly, but maybe that's too few. And maybe I do have enough resources to run more than 3 marketing campaigns. So now let's pretend we're going to do 25 clusters. Now that's too many. So how do we know it's too many? Well, aesthetically, having 25 clusters is very difficult to represent on the graph, but that's just aesthetics. Now, if we actually look at the statistics, we can see 2 other problems. First, the statistics are really similar between clusters, and that's an issue. But second, we can see that there are very few items in each of the clusters. And so this may not make a lot of sense. So let's go back. Let's go back to 5 clusters because that seems like possibly the best. Okay. But Tableau allows us to go further and do a little bit more complicated cluster analysis. Let's now do something called multi-factor variable analysis. And all that means is that instead of just using one variable, we can use multiple variables. So in addition to sales, what else could be useful to understand the data to decide on a marketing strategy? Well, if we go back on the left-hand side to data, perhaps profit would be an interesting variable to add as an average. And what else? Maybe profits per order. And this one, we keep it as an aggregate. The point here is that we can continue adding variables into the cluster analysis. The algorithm will continue to calculate clusters, and this can quickly become nonsensical. So it is very important to have a theory for why the variables get added. Otherwise, you will not be able to interpret the results. And if you, the data analyst, cannot interpret the results, then neither can the clients. So now we have 3 variables in our cluster algorithm. We want 5 clusters. Let's look at the statistics. Well, this time, as you can see, we have 3 different variables that's being computed for 5 clusters. And what we can see is that clusters 4 and 5 are quite different from the other clusters, which give us some confidence that we have indeed at least 2 clusters. Now, cluster 3, 2, and 1 would need to sit down and actually think about the data to see if those would make sense. But in this case, we have now clustered the data into 5 different profiles based on sales, profits, and orders, and we can now explain why we may have a strategy that has 5 different marketing campaigns. You can close the dialog box, save your work, and proceed to step 3.